They didn't choose him because they saw talent. They chose him because they were bored. Because calling on the quiet black kid to perform in front of the class sounded like a good laugh. They knew he wouldn't say no. They knew he wouldn't cause a scene. That's what made it funny, predictable, safe. His grandfather had once played soul on street corners and in packed churches. But none of them knew that. All they saw was a kid who never spoke up. A kid they thought couldn't possibly carry a melody, let alone a legacy. So when Ms. Harrow smiled and said, "Why don't you play something for us tomorrow?" the whole class grinned. They were expecting a disaster. They thought it would be awkward, off-key, maybe even painful to watch. But what they got was something else entirely. At Baycrest High School in Oakland, California, Elijah Carter had grown used to fading into the background. At just 16, he was a quiet, observant student, never the type to chase attention, never loud enough to disrupt. He got good grades, turned in every assignment early, and walked the halls like someone who had learned long ago not to expect much from others. No matter how hard he tried, no matter how well he performed, his teachers, especially in English and literature, rarely acknowledged his effort. It wasn't that they didn't see him. No, Elijah was always seen, but never really noticed. Not the way that mattered. They knew his name. They called attendance. But they didn't expect much. And that somehow hurt more than outright hostility. When he raised his hand, it was with a kind of aching hope. He'd studied. He knew the answer. But 9 times out of 10, the teacher's eyes would move past him, landing instead on the more familiar faces. The ones who fit a certain picture. The ones whose parents volunteered at fundraisers or had last names that rang comfortably in PTA meetings. He didn't resent those students. He just felt the quiet sting of being invisible, of being expected to stay quiet, stay ordinary, stay average. And he did. For a long time, Elijah learned to shrink himself to fit those expectations. His mother, always measured and practical, had taught him early, "You don't need to be loud to be heard. Let your work speak for you." But what if no one was listening? Baycrest prided itself on diversity and cultural engagement. But some classrooms told a different story, especially in Ms. Harrow's American literature class, where the curriculum danced around black voices, touching them only when required, then moving quickly on. When they covered Dr. King's I Have a Dream, Ms. Harrow read it aloud with a clipped tone, as if it were just another text to analyze, not a heartbeat in history. When Elijah raised his hand to share something personal, how the cadence of King's words reminded him of his grandfather's sermons, her response was always the same, a tight smile, a dismissive nod, and then, "Let's move on." Her favorite students weren't hard to spot. They were the ones whose essays used perfect MLA citations and quoted Thoreau and Emerson. The ones who never mispronounced juxtaposition. Their ideas, no matter how shallow, were met with praise. Elijah? He could write with rhythm and depth, could pull power from Baldwin and Morrison. But when he turned in his essays, they came back with short notes in red ink. Interesting but off-topic. The message was always the same. You're not what we expect. Not how we expect it. And so he stopped trying to impress. He still did the work. Still kept his head down. But he started pulling back. Offering less, blending more. The more effort he gave, the more it stung to be dismissed. He never told his mom. She had enough to handle working night shifts at the hospital. And besides, what would he even say? "My teacher doesn't see me?" It sounded so small, so petty. But it didn't feel small. It felt like walking through a fog that clung to his skin. Like being asked to prove every single day that he was more than they assumed and still being overlooked. It wasn't that they hated him. Indifference is colder than hate. Indifference made him question whether his presence even mattered. And that's what Elijah felt. Every time his hand stayed in the air too long. Every time his voice floated out into a room that didn't care to listen. Still, he never caused trouble. He followed the rules. Finished his reading. Sat in the same seat. And each time Ms. Harrow glanced past him for another student, Elijah would tell himself it didn't matter. But it did. And eventually, the ache settled somewhere deep, just below the surface of his silence. Then, on an otherwise normal Thursday morning, something changed. Elijah was at his desk, flipping through his worn paperback of Invisible Man when Miss Harrow looked directly at him. "Elijah," she said, voice smooth, "since we're talking about speeches, why don't you share your thoughts on Dr. Kingstone in I Have a Dream?" The classroom hushed. A few heads turned. Elijah froze. She hadn't called on him in months, maybe longer. And now, suddenly, this? His stomach flipped, but he knew the material. His hand hadn't even been raised. Still, he answered. "The tone is hopeful, but layered," he said slowly. "There's this undercurrent of pain, like he's dreaming because reality won't let him rest." Silence followed. Not the kind that came from awe. The kind that waits for someone to correct themselves. Miss Harrow arched an eyebrow. Not quite what I was looking for," she said flatly. "Let's ask someone else." And just like that, the moment was gone. But she wasn't finished. As Elijah tried to sink back into the anonymity of his desk, Miss Harrow flipped through her lesson planner. Then, almost too casually, she added, "Oh, by the way, I heard your grandfather was a musician." Elijah blinked. She smiled. "Too wide. Why don't you play something for us tomorrow? A little performance before class. Should be fun." Her tone was sugar-coated, but the room caught the scent of something sharper. Elijah didn't say anything. Not at first. He just sat there, blinking, the corners of his mouth tight, unsure if he'd misheard. But Miss Harrow was already writing something in her planner, as if the matter was settled. Around the room, a few students exchanged amused looks. Someone let out a soft chuckle. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. Andre turned in his seat, meeting Elijah's eyes with a look that was somewhere between disbelief and concern. Elijah kept still. His stomach turned. He hadn't played in public in years. And even then, it had only been at church in the back room when his grandfather was still alive. The idea of playing now in front of a room full of students who didn't care if he failed, maybe even hoped he would, felt like being asked to walk into fire. Miss Harrow didn't care about his music. This wasn't about creativity. It wasn't even about class participation. It was a setup. "Tomorrow, then," she added with that same sugar-dipped tone. "A little something soulful, maybe? I hear you've got that in your blood." Her eyes lingered just a second too long. And then she turned away, continuing the lesson as if nothing had happened. The rest of the period passed in a blur. Elijah didn't take notes. He didn't hear the discussion. He just sat there, the words echoing in his mind. "I hear you've got that in your blood." Like his family, his heritage was some sideshow to be trotted out for entertainment. Like his culture was something performative. Something you summoned when the room needed a little flavor. He could already feel it, what they wanted. They wanted him to fumble, to freeze, to press the wrong key or forget the rhythm. And then they'd laugh, or worse, they'd clap politely and whisper later about how brave he was for trying. It wasn't about the music. It was about proving a point. That he didn't belong. That no matter how well he read or wrote or thought, he'd always be the kid from the background. By the time the bell rang, Elijah could barely move. He stood slowly, clutching his backpack tighter than usual, and walked out without a word. Andre caught up to him in the hallway, lowering his voice. "Yo, you don't gotta do this, man. Seriously." Elijah shook his head. "If I don't, she wins." Andre sighed, his voice quieter now. "Then make it count." That night, Elijah didn't eat dinner. He just sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, replaying the moment over and over. Ms. Harrow's voice, the looks, the heat behind his eyes. He wasn't even sure what he was feeling, anger, maybe, shame, or that old ache of being put on display, not for who he was but for what they thought he represented. He wandered into the garage without thinking. The space was half storage, half memory. His mom kept old photo boxes stacked in the corners, holiday decorations shoved into bins. But against the back wall, beneath a dusty blanket, sat the old Yamaha keyboard. The one his grandfather had used every Saturday when he'd bring over friends from the church band. Elijah pulled off the cover. The keys were still there, a little yellowed, a little sticky at the edges. But they worked. He sat on the bench, stared down at them, and let his fingers hover. He didn't press anything at first. just breathed. He could still hear his grandfather's voice. Don't play the song, Eli. Play the feeling. He pressed one note, then another. The chords came back slowly, like a language he hadn't spoken in years but never truly forgot. He didn't bother with sheet music, didn't pull out his phone. He just played. His hands stumbled at first, but the muscle memory settled in. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about speaking without words. The melody that came out wasn't loud or polished. It wasn't something you'd hear on a stage, but it had weight, carried something: grief, resilience, pride. Elijah didn't need to rehearse. He needed to remember why this mattered, why letting them control the narrative wasn't an option. He played until his fingertips felt warm, until the sound filled the room just enough to drown out the doubt. When he finally stopped, the garage was quiet again. Still, he sat there staring at the keys. He hadn't even noticed his mom standing at the doorway. She didn't say anything, just nodded once, her eyes soft. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. Elijah stood, exhaled slowly, and walked past her back into the house. His heartbeat had steadied. His steps were sure. He wasn't walking into class tomorrow as a performer. He was walking in as a challenge. And this time, they were the ones who wouldn't be ready. The next morning, Elijah got dressed without rushing. He pulled on a plain navy sweater, khaki pants, and the same scuffed sneakers he wore most days. He didn't comb his hair twice, didn't rehearse what he'd say. He just moved through the house like someone who already knew what needed to be done. His mom stood at the kitchen counter, pouring coffee into her thermos. She glanced over as he passed. "You good?" Elijah paused, then nodded. "Yeah." It was the only word he needed. At school, the air felt heavier than usual. Or maybe it was just him. The hallway chatter seemed louder, the bells sharper. He moved through the corridors like he always did, shoulders slightly hunched, backpack tight against his spine. But there was something different in his gait, a quiet purpose. As he stepped into room 212, a hush fell almost instantly. Some kids had forgotten, others hadn't, and some had been waiting. The old classroom upright had been rolled from the storage closet and now stood near the whiteboard, dusty but upright, like a relic dragged into the light. A few students turned in their seats as Elijah entered. Andre gave him a short nod. It wasn't a cheer or a grin, just that quiet kind of nod that says, "I see you." Ms. Harrow stood near her desk, flipping through papers, acting like nothing about this day was different. But her eyes flicked up as he crossed the room. Elijah didn't sit. He walked straight to the piano. His palms were damp, but not from fear, at least not the kind he used to know. This wasn't stage fright. It was pressure, yes, but it came from inside, from knowing what this moment meant, from everything unsaid that had led to this desk, this key, this breath. He slid onto the bench, adjusted the height instinctively, and let his hands rest above the keys without touching them. The room was silent now. Even the ones who had smirked the day before had gone still. No one dared speak. No one dared move. Elijah closed his eyes. In his mind, the garage was back. The dust, the weight, the warmth of memory. He took one slow breath, then another. And then, with a touch so soft it was almost mist, he played. The first notes came like smoke, thin, slow, uncertain. A simple chord. Then another. A hymn without words. It wasn't flashy, wasn't fast. It was quiet, measured, and raw. His fingers moved gently, coaxing each note like it had something to say. The melody swayed low and aching, like something buried beneath years of silence. And for the first time in that classroom, no one was looking at Elijah Carter like a name on a roster. They weren't waiting for him to stumble. They weren't smirking. They were just still. The music filled the space between their assumptions. It curved around the desks and folded itself into the corners of the room. Ms. Harrow had stopped flipping pages. Her arms were crossed, but her gaze had shifted. It wasn't skepticism anymore. It was something else. As the notes settled deeper, Elijah leaned into the melody. His hands knew what to do now. They had always known. He didn't need anyone to say anything. He didn't need their praise. He just needed them to hear what he had carried all this time. And they were hearing it. The room stayed still. Not one foot tapped. Not a single whisper cut through the air. Elijah's fingers moved gently, brushing across the keys as though each note held breath. The sound wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. The opening melody unfolded like memory, like prayer, like something meant to be heard but not interrupted. A low, soulful phrase echoed through the classroom, bending into something older than the space it filled. The old upright piano trembled faintly beneath his touch, its age adding a texture that made the song feel worn, lived in, human. He didn't look up, didn't need to. He could feel it, the shift. The tension that had lived in the room since he walked in was unraveling, thread by thread, note by note. The laughter that had once threatened to burst at his expense had vanished. In its place was something quieter, something reverent. The notes turned more confident now, his fingers dancing into the melody his grandfather used to hum under his breath while tuning the keyboard in their garage. It wasn't written on any sheet. It didn't belong to anyone else. It was his. Each run of notes flowed into the next, smooth and seamless, like water spilling across stone. He changed pace, built momentum. The music grew fuller, layered, deeper. Not loud, not dramatic, but insistent, purposeful. Every key told a story, and with each phrase, Elijah took back something they'd tried to take from him. His rhythm, his voice, his presence. This wasn't just performance. It was reclamation. Across the room, Miss Harrow's arms were still crossed, but the hard line of her jaw had softened. Her eyes didn't move from the piano. She wasn't grading anymore. She wasn't waiting for a mistake. She was watching, listening. Elijah didn't care. This wasn't for her. Wasn't for the class. He wasn't here to teach anyone a lesson or win anyone over. He was here because they thought they knew him and they didn't. Andre leaned forward slightly, elbows on his desk, jaw slack, caught somewhere between shock and awe. He wasn't the only one. A girl who had never spoken to Elijah all year sat upright, hands frozen over her notebook. One of the football players, usually half asleep during first period, had stopped chewing his gum. There was no applause, no noise, just breathless attention. Elijah kept going. His hands moved with more weight now, not forceful but deliberate, like every note was carved out of something real. There was a moment midway through where his thumb slipped slightly. Not enough to jar the music, just enough to remind him that this was live, imperfect, human. He didn't flinch. He played through it, and somehow that imperfection made the melody more honest. It gave it teeth. It gave it soul. He let the music rise gently, not to a peak, but into a stretch, an elongated breath that sat thick in the air. And then, slowly, he let it fall. The tempo eased. The melody curled back into itself, smaller now, more intimate. As if the music had told its story and was now quietly stepping away. His final chord was soft, barely there. His fingers rested on the keys for a second longer than needed, then lifted, soundless. He didn't move, didn't exhale. The silence that followed was not empty. It was electric. The room had changed. He hadn't demanded it, but it had changed all the same. No one clapped. No one moved. It wasn't because they didn't care. It was because something about the performance had reached them before their reactions could catch up. For once, Elijah wasn't being evaluated. He wasn't being measured against a rubric or fit into a mold. He was being witnessed. Only after several seconds did he lift his head, just enough to look around. Eyes met his. Not all, but enough. And they didn't look away. They didn't laugh. They didn't pretend to be unaffected. Some looked stunned. Others looked ashamed. And then there were a few, just a few, who looked at him with something like respect. He stood slowly, pressing his palms against his thighs to still their faint tremble. He didn't bow, didn't wait for permission. He simply turned from the bench and walked back toward his desk. As he passed Andre, he caught a low murmur. "You killed that." It was soft, genuine, and it was enough. Miss Harrow didn't say anything. Not right away. She stood behind her desk, arms still crossed, gaze fixed somewhere just behind him. And for the first time, she didn't seem certain, didn't seem in control. Her expression wasn't disapproving or proud. It was something quieter, something unsettled. She opened her mouth slightly, as if to say something, then closed it again. Elijah didn't look back. The silence didn't break. It lingered, thick and unmoving, like the air after a storm. Elijah had returned to his seat, but no one quite knew what to do next. It was as if the rules of the classroom had shifted, and no one had gotten the memo. Ms. Harrow cleared her throat once, sharply, as if trying to reclaim her authority, but even that sound felt hollow. She straightened a stack of papers that didn't need straightening, her fingers tapping nervously against the desk. But the usual rhythm of the room was gone. Students shifted in their chairs, glancing at one another with uncertain eyes. Some looked at Elijah, then looked away quickly, as if ashamed they hadn't expected this. Others stared longer, their expressions unreadable. Andre didn't say anything, but he kept looking at Elijah like he was seeing something he hadn't noticed before. Not surprise, not awe, just clarity, like something had clicked. Then came the voice, soft, from the back of the room. A girl, one of the quiet ones, the kind who always sat with her head down, who rarely spoke unless called on. If he had messed up, she said, her voice steady but quiet, would you have praised him for trying? No one moved. No one laughed. Her words floated out into the space between desks and hung there, untouched. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even directed. But it landed. Ms. Harrow blinked. Just once. She opened her mouth as if to answer, but nothing came out. Her jaw tightened. She shifted her weight. But the question didn't need a response. Everyone already knew. That was the point. The classroom didn't erupt. No applause. No speeches. Just a subtle shift. Like someone had cracked open a window no one had noticed was sealed. The tension that had clung to Elijah for so long, the skepticism, the quiet doubts, had lost their footing. Something else had taken root in its place. Elijah didn't revel in it. He didn't smirk. Didn't look around for recognition. He just sat there, hands resting calmly on the edge of his desk, breathing in the unfamiliar stillness. For the first time, he wasn't waiting for someone to dismiss him. He wasn't bracing for the sigh, the deflection, the subtle ways people tried to erase you without ever saying your name. What he had done couldn't be undone, and it couldn't be ignored. Across the room, he noticed one of the boys who used to mimic his voice when the teacher wasn't around, always just low enough for it to feel like a joke. But now, that same boy was staring down at his notebook, jaw clenched, lips pressed together like he was wrestling with something new. Others sat with their heads slightly lowered, not out of shame, but reflection. No one had expected to be moved that morning. No one had walked into room 212 thinking they'd leave changed. But now they weren't sure how to go back to before. The bell rang, but no one moved. Not at first. It was only when Ms. Harrow finally spoke. Something clipped and procedural about reading homework. That chairs scraped gently across the floor and backpacks rustled open. As Elijah stood to leave, a few eyes followed him. Some curious, some respectful, none mocking. Andre didn't say anything right away, but as they walked out together, he nudged Elijah with his elbow, just once. That was different, he said, voice low. Like, all the way different. Elijah offered a faint smile, but said nothing. Words weren't necessary. Not anymore. He could feel it. Not admiration. Not awe. Just space. Room to exist. Room to be seen. And that, more than anything, felt new. Elijah didn't rush home that day. He walked slowly, letting the quiet follow him like a second shadow. The sidewalk felt a little different beneath his shoes. Not softer, just lighter. He wasn't thinking about what people had said, or what they hadn't. He wasn't replaying the melody in his head. He wasn't even thinking about Ms. Harrow. He was thinking about the silence. Not the one that came before the music, but the one that came after. That silence had meant something. He didn't need applause. He didn't need validation. What he needed was that stillness, that pause, That unspoken moment when everyone in the room had to face the fact that they had been wrong about him. And maybe, just maybe, they were wrong about others too. He didn't expect things to change overnight. He knew that most people in that classroom would go back to their routines, their assumptions, their comfort zones. But something had shifted, whether they admitted it or not. He had played for himself. Not to prove a point. Not to win anyone over. Just to remember who he was, who he had always been. For so long, he had tried to fit into whatever space the world allowed him. But in that moment, seated in front of a dusty classroom piano, he had carved out a space of his own. A space that didn't ask permission. That didn't wait to be seen. A space that simply existed, undeniable and whole. When he got home, his mom was folding laundry on the couch. She looked up as he entered, eyes scanning him briefly, then softening. "You play?" she asked. Elijah nodded. "They hear you?" she added. He didn't answer. He just sat down beside her, picked up a towel and began folding. He knew people would always carry their assumptions. That no performance could erase a lifetime of judgment. But he also knew something more important now. That those assumptions didn't matter. That he didn't have to live small just because others couldn't see the full measure of who he was. He had played. He had spoken without speaking. And they had heard him, even if just for a moment. And that moment, it was enough.